Check, mic check, mic check. Check, 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 check. All right. How you guys doing this evening? Are we ready to get started? All right. So I have the distinct pleasure of getting us started this evening. And what a beautiful way to spend this Sunday evening with all you beautiful people in this room. I'm super proud and feel super privileged to be celebrating the 20-year anniversary of Critical Resistance and the legacy that they're building, y'all. I want to start off by giving thanks to all my relations. I want to give thanks to Mother Earth, to First Nation people, to the caretakers of this land, to the Creator for another day of life, and for the life of all the abolitionists and freedom fighters that are in this room here today, but also to all the abolitionists and freedom fighters that came before us, that laid down the work for us to be able to be here today. All the martyrs, all the people behind bars, all the people who gave up their lives, all the people whose shoulders we stand on. Y'all give them one round of applause so that they can hear us all the way up. So my name is Sagnicthe Salazar, for those of you guys who don't know me, and I don't know a lot of people in this space. I actually don't know why I was asked to do this, because there's a lot of amazing people in this room, but I'm part of Xicana Moratorium Coalition, and I've had the pleasure of not only doing this work alongside of CR since the 98 conference when I was in middle school. I think I was in 6th grade. How many of y'all were at the 98 conference? So I've had the pleasure of not only doing work alongside of Critical Resistance since that point, but I've actually had the distinct pleasure of celebrating a lot with Critical Resistance over the last few years. I'll share with you guys some of the celebrations, starting with being able to celebrate that Oakland was the first city in the country to defeat a gang injunction, a lawsuit against individuals who are so-called gang members, but really a tactic to criminalize Black and brown communities at mass, right? We were able to defeat that out here in Oakland with Critical Resistance. We were actually also able to defeat Urban Shield, the largest weapons expo and training in the world. And with Critical Resistance and the Stop Urban Shield Coalition, we were able to actually say, you know what? We're saying no to Urban Shield, and it stopped. So we were able to do that. Give yourself a hand if you were a part of that campaign, y'all. And more recently, was able to be a part of the celebration of Critical Resistance getting a new building, which a lot of you guys know. And that space represents land, it represents space, and it represents resources for the people. And I know that with the legacy of CR and the hard work of Critical Resistance, that's gonna mean a tremendous amount of treasure and a lot of building for our communities. So big hand for all the work that's to come as CR is building in that space, y'all. At this celebration, I'm not gonna take too much time, but I wanna tell you guys a little bit about what I think about when I think of Critical Resistance. When I think of Critical Resistance, I think of an organization that for the last 20 years has pushed the left, has pushed organizations, and has pushed coalitions to move past reform. And they've done 4 major things. They've been able to pump the brakes on the prison industrial complex. They've been able to shift the narrative of what prisons and policing represent. They've been able to lift the voices of those most impacted on the inside. And they've also done this all while dreaming and building. They've pumped the brakes on the prison industrial complex from the Bronx to LA to San Francisco, preventing the pouring of millions of dollars to continue building cages. They've shifted and halted major policies that advance policing, imprisonment, surveillance, and the criminalizations of communities of color, such as the gang injunctions, such as Urban Shield, and stopping the expansion and the spending on increasing policing in our communities. They've shifted the narrative, working diligently through major conferences, which many of you guys have been a part of, through campaigns and amazing media work, through reports and other forms of political education to shift the idea that imprisonment, more police, and other forms of social control equal safety. They've changed that narrative to actually say policing is a public health issue, and it is harmful to our communities. And in order for us to have health in our communities, we don't need policing. We need freedom and self-determination for our communities, always with those most impacted at the forefront. CR has been saying that for the last 20 years, y'all. So give CR a hand for that, because it is CR who actually began coining the term the prison industrial complex, which a lot of us, especially those of us in the education system, have been able to take to continue building on what it means to shift not only the prison system, but all the pipelines that lead to that system, that lead our young people into that system. They've also lifted the voice and the resistance of imprisoned people and supported their organizing to shift conditions on the inside. Many of you guys have seen the Abolitionist newspaper, and it reaches 6,500 imprisoned people across the country. It's in Spanish and English, and it allows folks inside to share campaign strategies, allows folks inside to share with each other and build with each other, and also for those of us on the outside who are very in a very purposeful way, kept out of what's happening inside, know how to support and do the work. And they've also been able to, through media work, outreach, and legislative support, been able to support a lot of the campaigns on the inside, including the 30,000 prison-strong coalition prisoner hunger strike, y'all. They were able to support that hunger strike. And last but not least, through different projects, such as the Oakland Power Project. Give a big hand if you're a part of the Oakland Power Project, y'all. All right, so that means if you don't know what the Oakland Power Project is, that means you gotta find out, because that's an amazing project that, that as CR does is actually, CR is not waiting for tomorrow to build a future. They're doing it now, right? And it means creating the change right now, and standing firm on the belief that to achieve real change, we must abolish not only every prison, but we must abolish the system of policing at its foundation and its core to achieve real freedom and a world that we can hand down to the next 7 generations to come, y'all. So, like I said, I feel super privileged, super humbled, super honored to be up here to start off this evening of gratitude for the 20 years of the legacy that has been CR and that continues. And I want to thank all of you guys for being here, because abolition is not just about dismantling the toxic prison industrial complex, but it's about building something that we're going to replace it with. And it's going to take each and every one of you guys, it's going to take everyone in this room breaking out of our silos of our organizations. It's going to take us letting go of our egos and not wavering on a dream for freedom. So all of you guys who are here today, let's celebrate today, but the work continues, y'all. And we got a lot of work to go, because our children are depending on it, because our next generations are depending on it. And there's way too many people whose lives are at risk today, whose lives have been lost. And the work is do or die. And I think that in a lot of the work that Critical Resistance has done from the beginning, I think it's that importance, that urgency, and that need to find freedom now that pushes a lot of us into the work. And I want to say CR has an amazing model. I didn't know this till I became a little bit more involved in the work, but a lot of the work that Critical Resistance does is all volunteers. Right? There's not that many, there's only a handful of folks that are paid to do the work, but it takes that dedication, that commitment, and that unwavering dream for freedom. So give yourself a hand for being here tonight. So there's a lot of amazing people who are going to join the stage, but I want to introduce someone who's foundational to this work, who's going to come up and introduce the next speaker. I began building with Critical Resistance through this amazing individual, actually, Rachel Herzing. So Rachel is not only a wonderful friend, but someone who has always been strategic, who's always been critical and super methodical, and always in the different spaces that we share pushes us to never take our eyes off the prize, right? Rachel is a co-founder of Critical Resistance. She was the first national field organizer, and also served as Critical Resistance Development and Campaign Director. She was, as a member of Critical Resistance, she engaged in a lot of different work, so I won't mention it all because she's about to come up and there's a lot of amazing things to share, but just to share a little bit, she was foundational in the work of Stop the Injunctions Coalition. She was also a co-founder of the Oakland Power Project, which built alternatives to calling the cops and using the cops as a resource, right, which is actually harmful to our communities. She's also a founding member of Third World Resistance, which is a network that still brings together third world organizations to build on an anti-imperialist platform. And she is currently the co-director of Center for Political Education, which has been able to do a lot of work to develop organizers, not only in the Oakland CR chapter, but also the progressive left, working class, and people of color. Critical Resistance definitely owes a lot to and loves not only the work that Rachel is currently doing with Center for Political Education, but all the work that Rachel has done to fortify and support the work of Critical Resistance over the years. So please help me in giving a warm welcome to Rachel Herzing.
Exciting to be taller than somebody. Happens very rarely. So the business at hand is that somebody blocked in the DJs and the danzantes. So if you parked back there and you were like, I'm just gonna scoot it right here and hope for the best has come to roost and you need to get your car out the way. So just go back out into the parking lot and take care of your situation, yeah? Thank you. The real business of the evening. "20 years ago, I didn't need glasses. And according to these pictures, I was a much younger person. But happy anniversary, Critical Resistance. And I'm really grateful to be here, so thank you for inviting me to participate in this amazing celebration. And thanks to all of you who came out to celebrate with Critical Resistance. I am honored and incredibly happy to introduce Angela White Davis this evening. And in some ways, it feels a little odd to introduce Angela in a crowd like this, because I feel many of you have no doubt been influenced by her revolutionary thought, or inspired by her political activity, or have worked alongside her, so you're probably already quite familiar with her. So rather than recite a list of Angela's jobs and outstanding achievements, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think Angela is so important, not only to Critical Resistance, but to the movement for the abolition of the prison industrial complex. In 2012, during a public conversation between Angela and Grace Lee Boggs made a special point to describe herself and Angela as activist philosophers. Boggs went on to say, "We can't think anymore that all we have to do is act. We have to reimagine revolution and get beyond protest." And Angela's work as a philosopher and an activist has encouraged many of us to reimagine what's possible and has pushed us to get to work on shifting our conditions and fighting for our freedom. So it's important here, I think, to remember that Angela is trained in a particular kind of philosophy. And I won't get too carried away talking about this, but I do think it's key, because it's not random that we have the thought coming from her that we do. Her training under Herbert Marcuse, for instance, I think is crucial, because Angela's thought is not only deeply rooted in an analysis of the time, place, and conditions in which we seek to make change, but it also encourages us to think seriously about the implications of our activism. So we're dreaming big while we're thinking about what is happening contemporaneously with the work that we want to do. I think, Marcuse's commitment to philosophy was so deeply engaged with revolutionary social and political change. And that seems to be a lesson that was really learned well by Angela. Her work and example help us dispel the myth and that thinking and doing are two separate, and if we're honest in our movements, antagonistic spheres. She reminds us that these two spheres, far from being separate, are mutually constituted and reinforcing. Through her own writing and the elevation of the thought and writing of others, she also helps break down the myth that imprisoned people are not movement philosophers, or that intellectual work is of no use to imprisoned people. Has anybody here read If They Come in the Morning, Voices of Resistance? If you have, I suggest a reread. If you have not, I would suggest this get on your list right away. She edited the collection with Bettina Eptiker, and the first edition came out in 1971. And it's an amazing, amazing collection. If They Come in the Morning helps us understand Angela, Ruchell McGee, and the Soledad brothers as sharp movement analysts. The book also puts their analysis into dynamic conversation with activist appeals for their freedom and for the freedom of political prisoners more generally. Abolition is in there too. And for those of you who are newer to this line of thinking, as I mentioned, that book was published in 1971. In their preface to the volume, Davis and Eptiker write, "The judicial and prison systems are to be increasingly defined as instruments for unbridled repression, institutions which may be successfully resisted, but which are more and more impervious to meaningful reform. Rather, they must be transformed in the revolutionary sense." And I raised this book tonight because of the way it combines rigorous analysis with calls to action. And that, I think, is crucial for today's movements. I think we could use more of that. I raised the book because I think it's important to remember that the thinking and activity that underpin today's movement against the prison industrial complex extends back decades, and there is a long and rich history to learn from. I also raised the book because I think the commitment to working out ideas for social change is an ongoing process. There's another book by Angela I'm guessing many of you are familiar with called Are Prisons Obsolete? And you can see traces of her earlier thinking from If They Come in the Morning there as well. And I think, what we see as the evolution is how those ideas have been tested over time in the intervening years. This rigorous commitment to pushing the limits of our thinking and putting ideas into practice, and then returning to make the ideas stronger, and then putting them back into practice, has marked Angela's work. Whether that's forwarding the concept of prison industrial complex abolition, and making sure that women and trans people are always at the center of those conversations as well. Whether that is pushing for freedom of political prisoners, or whether that's demanding the end of the occupation of Palestine and the right to return. I'm inspired by Angela's commitment to advancing philosophies that fuel our prospects for freedom and self-determination. There wouldn't be a critical resistance without a highly developed analysis of prison industrial complex abolition, let alone a 20th anniversary celebration of the conference that started it all without Angela. And Angela's influence is at the heart of all of the organization's work, I think. So it's my true pleasure to welcome our mentor, comrade, and friend, Angela Davis.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And it's a real honor to have been introduced by Rachel Herzing. I was thinking maybe I should go back and read If They Come in the Morning. Because that book came out when I was in jail. Yeah. And interestingly, several months ago, I was in North Carolina and had the opportunity to meet a woman whose case is profiled in If They Come in the Morning, a woman by the name of Marie Hill, who was, I think, 15 years old when she was sentenced to death in North Carolina. It was really amazing to talk about her case to the audience at Duke, and then to introduce her. Well, anyway, I can't believe that we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of critical resistance. I guess you have to be probably at least 40 or so, or close to 40, or older to experience this sense of incredulity. It really does seem like it was yesterday, doesn't it, Cassandra? Gina and Linda and Dorsey. But then on the other hand, when you consider the vastly changed public consciousness regarding prisons and policing, then you realize that critical resistance has accomplished so much within such a relatively short period of time. So I want to begin by thanking all of those who have kept the organization and the movement going over the last 2 decades. Jess, Lily, Mohammed, Rachel, of course, Isaac, Ari, and many, many more. We know that their stunning work would never have been possible without the dedication and brilliance of Rose Brass. And I know that we dedicate this 20th anniversary celebration to Rose's memory. Her legacy is the glue that has held together the radical organizing, the transformative politics, and the abolitionist philosophy of critical resistance. Thank you, Rose. I would like us also to think about the people in prison who can't be here. We can never forget that our comrades in struggle, many of our comrades in struggle are behind bars and are unable to be with us in person. But we thrive because their ideas have been the driving force to the work that we have done. As extensive and as out in the open as organizing around prison issues is today, from one end of the political spectrum to the other, it may be difficult to realize that before the first CR conference, while radical anti-prison organizing was happening, activists were largely unaware of the work their counterparts were doing in various parts of the country. There was work around political prisoners, educational work within jails and prisons, a lot of unrecognized work with women in prison. There were organizations that had recently formed and older organizations from the 1960s and the 1970s. But it was not until that conference actually took place that we came to recognize just how many people were actually doing this work all over the country and in many parts of the world. Those of us on the organizing committee all remember that we were hoping to attract a few hundred people. And I think we talked about 350 or so, right? That would have been a major success. But as it turned out, as many of you know, 3,500 people showed up at UC Berkeley for that conference in September of 1998. And the Critical Resistance Conference, which took place a little more than 20 years ago, served as a catalyst for a much-needed movement, for a movement that developed a more complex analysis of the relationship between the soaring prison population, rising racism, declining resources for poor people, people of color. And you know, I was trying to think of the names of all of the people who were involved, and I know that some of them are missing, but I went and pulled out the poster. And the names of the organizing committee begin with Ellen Berry, then Jennifer Beach, Rose Braz, and Julie Brown. But I know that for some reason, Bo Rita Brown's name isn't here, and I don't know why. Cynthia Chandler, Kamari Clark, Angela Davis, Leslie Di Benedetto Skopek, Gita Drury, Rain Galbraith, Nanine Karaka, Stephanie Kelly, Terry Coopers, Rachel Lederman, Joyce Miller, Dorsey Nunn, Dylan Rodriguez, Eli Rosenblatt, Cassandra Shaler, Andy Smith, Nancy Stoller, Julia Sudbury, Robin Templeton, Saran Thrift, Greg Winter. But there were many, many others. So what names am I missing here? Gina Dent. Absolutely. What other names?
George Galver.
Who?
George Galver.
I'm sorry, the acoustics aren't that good here, so I'm having trouble making.
George Galvos.
George Galvos, right. Thank you, thank you. Thank you for the clarity of your voice. Anyone else? Yeah, why don't you just call the names out? Well, actually, Ruthie is listed as a member of the advisory committee, but you're absolutely right. She was involved in the actual organizing. And there are other people. Donna Wilmot, I know Donna is here. I saw her earlier. Adrian Wing. Partial list of sponsors, Blessing Way Foundation. I know that Ed Cohen gave us $50,000, which is about all of the money we had. and what was so incredible, I don't have a lot of time, so I can't go off script, but what was so incredible was that we did not have a single paid organizer. But the organizers reflected a broad group of activists, of scholars, advocates, and our major concern was to assist in the production of a popular understanding of the reasons for the rising numbers of people in prison. And also, of course, to take up the call for abolition that, as Rachel pointed out, had come out of the prison movement in the early 1970s. We were intent on developing an anti-racist, anti-capitalist, feminist approach that would be what now is frequently referred to as intersectional. We wanted to avoid easy answers and to encourage a kind of a complexity in our understanding that would challenge the idea that there were any easy fixes. And we especially wanted to challenge prison reform. And I actually get quite angry today when people refer to us as prison reformers. The two terms that we tried to offer to the movement were prison industrial complex and abolition. There was no easy solution to the problem because we were dealing not with a simple issue, but with an amalgam of economic and political and cultural and representational forces that were responsible in a complex way for the hegemonic notion that Black people, indigenous people, people of color, poor people, trans people, and others were naturally inclined to criminality. And that the only way to address this was to put people in prison. So we had to do what we then called borrowing a strategy from Stuart Hall, is we had to disarticulate crime and punishment. We had to pull the causal connection of crime and punishment apart and begin to think about the reasons why people were really in prison. Not because they had committed a crime, but because of racism, because of the fact that politicians were winning elections by exploiting the notion of law and order. Corporations were profiting. Established media were writing the ways of these ideas for their own successes. Architects were benefiting from the rise in the prison population. Telephone companies, the construction industry was expanding. There were new prisons and jails in California. As a matter of fact, there was something like a 500% increase from the early 80s to the early 90s. And so therefore, we decided that we would call our conference Critical Resistance because resistance was critical at that point. It was crucial, it was urgent. But at the same time, we had to be critical in our resistance. And I think those meanings are still very much indicative of why critical resistance is so important. Critical resistance beyond the prison industrial complex. And we thought that by using this term critical and prison industrial complex, which Mike Davis had actually used in an article that was written about the transformation of the California economy from an agricultural economy to a prison-based economy. We decided to use that for the whole phenomenon, which would mean that we would have to address a whole range of issues. Capitalism, the media, the politicians, et cetera, et cetera. As a matter of fact, I brought the call to the conference too. And you know, those were the days when we actually had to reproduce these flyers. Almost 2 million people are currently locked up in US prisons and jails, the majority of whom are people of color. Since 1980, the population of prisons has tripled, and it is expected to double again by 2005. While imprisoned populations are overwhelmingly male, the number of women prisoners is increasing at an even greater rate than men, et cetera, et cetera. The growing reliance on imprisonment as a solution to systemic social problems, combined with the mounting corporate interest in an ever-expanding punishment industry, has led to the emergence of a late 20th century prison industrial complex. And we all go on to point out that this prison industrial complex, which includes private and super maximum prisons, we were just beginning to really learn about supermaxes at that time, not only violates the civil and human rights of incarcerated men and women, but it poses grave threats to the very future of democracy in our country and throughout the world. And I also brought the call for papers, which I don't have time to read because it's a legal size sheet. But I do want to read the very last paragraph. The conference is structured to encourage participants to engage with others outside their own fields of expertise. Thus, each panel must reflect two or more of the above subject areas. And the above subject areas included things like prisoners industry, abolitionist alternatives, etc. And each panel must include presenters from diverse backgrounds who are capable of addressing issues of race, gender, sexuality, age, etc. Yeah. And we got some of the most amazing proposals. A very good friend of mine who lives in Australia by the name of Amanda George, I first met her by reading her proposal. In any event, there's no way that I can adequately assess the importance of the work critical resistance has done over the last 2 decades. Of course, there were those of us who helped to organize the conference, but the real work was done by the activists in the aftermath of that conference. Rachel and Isaac and Rose, who was a member of the organizing committee. Without the steadfast commitment of CR activists and those with whom they have worked in other affiliated organizations, we would not have witnessed the rise of movements calling not for reform, but for the abolition of the existing system of punishment and policing. There are 2 points that I want to try to make. I realize that I could speak for the next 5 hours about the importance of critical resistance. But I want to confine myself to, I'm not going to speak for, I think I have at the most 10 minutes left. And probably less than that, because Lily's going to give me a time sheet probably very soon. But what we were attempting to point out was that the rise of the prison industrial complex represented the articulation of structural racism with global capitalism. The 1980s, of course, was the period during which all over the world we witnessed the rise of global capitalism and neoliberal ideology. We were witnessing the effects of the deindustrialization of the economy, the migration of capitalist corporations, like especially in auto and steel, to other countries where labor forces were cheaper. And I mean, this is how the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue actually made his money. You know what I'm talking about, right? So these developments were combined with the decline of the welfare state and thus the disestablishment of institutions that had been designed to assist poor people when unemployment and lack of resources made it impossible for people to live normal lives. This was the period when we were witnessing the privatization of healthcare, the privatization of education, also the outsourcing of prison services to private corporations, as well as outright privatization. This is why it was necessary to consider other institutional changes. So we were thinking about health, the health industry, we were thinking about education. But what I think is especially important today and relevant today is the fact that the very same conditions that were leading to the incarceration of ever larger numbers of people of color and poor people, especially women, were causing people from the global south, whose economies were also affected by global capitalism, to try to seek ways to migrate to places where they might find hope for better lives. And I mention this because people don't often make the connection between the rise of the prison industrial complex and the conditions that have unleashed the various migrations. Well, first of all, the migration of corporations, because they were the first to migrate, right? Nobody ever called them illegal. When they moved to other countries. And so I mention this because immigrant detention is now an integral element of the prison industrial complex. And because the conditions underlying migration from countries like Honduras and Guatemala and Nicaragua are very much related to the conditions responsible for the increase in structural racism inside the US and the increase during the 80s and 90s of the numbers of people behind bars. The other point that I want to make has to do with the global scope of the prison industrial complex, and we might say prison and police industrial complex. I just actually arrived back in the country this morning. Gina Dent and I were in Brazil yesterday, attending a national conference of Black women that took place in Goiânia in the state of Goiás. The theme of the conference was Black women against racism and violence and for life, or for the good life. It's kind of hard to translate from the Portuguese. They are addressing exactly the same conditions that are even more repressive in Brazil. Brazil now has the third largest prison population in the world, with an ever-expanding network of prisons. This is complemented by racist police violence that clearly surpasses what our experience of the horrors of police violence in this country. And there are the related violences of femicide and suicide. Some months ago, you may be familiar with this assassination that happened some months ago of Marielle Franco, who was a radical anti-violence and anti-racist queer activist, and she was an elected official, a member of the City Council of Rio de Janeiro. We've so often received solidarity from people in Brazil for the struggles that we are engaged in here. And I think now is the time to generate solidarity in our ranks. We've learned how important it has been to develop links with Palestinian resistors, how our call for justice for Palestine has helped to enrich the very meaning of abolition, not only for Palestine, but for us in the US. Because the election of Bolsonaro was clearly inspired by the election of Trump here in the US. Oh, I was not supposed to mention his name, I'm sorry. Yeah, because sometimes we get too ensconced in the moment and we fail to think about the long term and how we really represent the future. But it is our responsibility to stand with our Brazilian comrades to defend the legacy of Marielle Franco and to say no to military policing, to prison expansion, and to racist violence in Brazil, in the US, and throughout the world. And so that's all I have to say. I'm not leaving, so you can sit down. Because I was asked to make remarks for 15 or 20 minutes, and I hope I remained within the guidelines. Did I? Okay. So my next task is to introduce the panelists who are going to engage in each other in conversation, and I will serve as the moderator. So as I introduce, I'm not going to do as amazing as an introduction as Rachel did. For me, I feel really that I'm coming up short here. But I'd like to first introduce Kamau Walton. But I do have a few words to say. Kamau is a member of Critical Resistance. They joined CR Oakland in 2010, I think it was. Kamau was a key organizer in the victorious Stop the Injunction campaign, supporting outreach, mobilizations, community events to build up Oaklanders' resistance to policing. Kamau also was involved in mobilizing and organizing the movement to abolish solitary confinement in California following the 2013 prison hunger strikes. And they were an early organizer in the Stop Urban Shield campaign. And yes, let's once again celebrate that Critical Resistance, together with the Arab Resource Organizing Committee and a number of other organizations, got rid of Urban Shield. The next person I want to introduce is Linda Evans. Linda is a co-founder of All of Us or None. She is a former political prisoner, and she was imprisoned for anti-imperialist actions in the 1970s and the 1980s. Linda has been a close ally of CR since being released in 2001. And you know, I was thinking that you were a member of the committee, but yeah, you were in
I was inside.
prison. But she made up for it when she got out. She's done, I mean, there's so much in her bio. Plan for a safer Oakland. Invest in people, not police and prisons. Stand up for youth. Reentry support for people coming home for prisons. And, you know, Linda's just absolutely incredible. I don't know. There's so much here, Linda. I just want to thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for dedicating your life to this struggle. And the third person who will participate in the conversation is Mary Hooks. Mary is co-director of Southerners on New Ground. You're familiar with SONG, which is a home for LGBTQ liberation across all lines of race, class, abilities, age, culture, gender, sexuality, and it's in the South. I was talking to Mary at NW, the National Women's Studies Association meeting. When was that? That was like in November, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And I was asking her about the work she was doing, and she told me about this project. It's called The Lord's Work. Are you familiar with it?
No.
Who wants to do the Lord's work? L-O-R-D-E.
Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde.
Audre Lorde's work. But I think I'm just going to move over. And I've been...
What a treat.
And I know we've done it before. I'll take another one.
Do it again.
And I'm yeah, I hadn't seen Linda for a while, so okay, so there are a number of questions that that we would like you to address. This isn't working. I'm sorry, I'm a little taller than...
I was sitting in that chair.
You
When
were
they
sitting
did the
in this
mic
chair.
check.
Yeah, Linda was in the chair when they did the mic check, so. So, the first question we would like you to address is how you became involved in the abolitionist movement. What was your entry point? When was it? Did it have anything to do with critical resistance? And maybe since you're the first person, Linda.
Since
I'll
I'm
ask
the
you.
oldest. I remember.
Yes. Well, I'm older than you are, so.
I'm not sure about that. I was locked up in federal prison when the first Critical Resistance Conference happened. And I remember very distinctly that Eve Goldberg, my partner, and I were working on an article. We had just decided to do this. I was studying neoliberalism, finishing college in prison, and felt like we needed to write something about how neoliberalism and global capitalism were affecting prisons and what prison had to do with that. So we were writing, Eve was going to the library. This is all very old school. going to the library, doing research in the library, looking up things in, those magazine indexes, Xeroxing things and sending them in to me in prison, trying to write together. It was quite a project. In the middle of this, a friend of mine who was visiting, another former political prisoner, Bo Brown, told me about an organization that was forming called Critical Resistance. I don't even know if that name existed then when Bo was telling me about it. And I remember being in awe that there was an organization forming that was going to try to abolish prisons. I felt like, this is impossible. I was in prison, hello. And I'm like, okay, good, let's abolish prisons, but how the heck are we gonna do it? She told me about a conference that was happening, and the Prison Activist Resource Center decided that they would publish our article. This is a pristine 20-year-old copy of the Prison Industrial Complex and the Global Economy, which many of you hopefully have read, although it definitely needs updating. And this was an incredibly important connection for me as an activist locked up inside federal prison looking at a 40-year sentence, and the feeling that I could have a voice, and a voice that would be listened to and respected, and that I could be a part of building an abolitionist movement. So for me, the production of this and the inclusion of it in the registration packets of the conference was a tremendous connection and very important psychologically, emotionally, and I think helped me understand at a different level what really was going on outside. Because when you're locked up, it's very, very difficult to get any kind of information about what activists are doing, about what the political arguments are that are going on, what is of the moment. So I was extremely appreciative of that effort of Critical Resistance to include me and prisoners in the process of connecting with that first conference. And the other thing that I learned at the same time was about the Delano II campaign and the effort to prevent the construction of a prison in Delano, a second prison. The fact that people were going after prison construction in that time when there had been 23 new prisons in the last 10 years built in California was awe-inspiring and shocking. And I feel like it's very important for all of us here today to recognize that it was the unity of activists on the outside, the building of very unusual coalitions, including the environmental movement, including the NAACP and the ACLU, including a legislative strategy, including a litigation strategy. Creative thinking built our movement. And I think that that's crucial for us to continue to engage in the level of discussion and strategizing that we need at a deep level to move forward. So those are the two entry points for me.
Mine is not nearly as intricate or glorious or brilliant as Linda framed for herself. I joined Critical Resistance in 2010. I came into CR after doing a lot of LGBT organizing, but mostly LNG, if you know what I mean. And I was really dissatisfied with the ways that it was not really having an impact on all of my people and all of my communities and all of the folks that I throw down with and for. And this little muffin named Isaac Loves Monko who I said I would name drop, kept inviting me to all these random things, like this town hall about these gang injunctions, and I went to some CR workshops at the US Social Forum in Detroit that year, and my mind was blown. I was like, I'm from Ohio. We don't have like ethnic studies and cultural studies and things like that in middle school. So like these were not things that I knew. I was new to California too. And yeah, and I think after I went to those workshops, I joined CR like maybe 3 or 4 weeks later. And I think there's this activity, if any of y'all have ever been to a CR workshop, where they have the concentric circles that talk about how the prison industrial complex is a set of interests that uses these tools, that impacts these problems, and impacts these people, all of these different parts, right? And I was like, those are my people, those are my people. I see that thing, this is there too, oh my gosh. And I had an understanding in that 2 hours of how abolition was going to help to liberate all of my people. And so I started showing back up. And at first I did prisoner mail. That was the first piece of the work that I did in CR, and then eventually I joined the Stop the Injunctions Coalition because the injunctions were happening like in the neighborhood where I was living. And that was the first campaign I ever participated in and the first campaign I ever won. And yeah, and I think like from then until now, my understanding of abolition has, yes, there you go. All right. But yeah, that was how I joined CR.
It's really great to win the first campaign.
It is. I tell myself that now when I'm not winning. Yeah, I'm like, that one time though, that one time.
It feels good. Oh, wow, this is a great question, but I have to say thank you so much for the CR family for having me and for having song. I sit as one, but represent thousands of dangerous queer and trans folks across the South who have been blessed and inspired by the work of CR. So thank you. Put the mic up. Thank you. And just shout out to Kara Page, who is Deep Song fam and love that's in the audience. So yeah, I'll answer the question, because I could go on all night being gracious and grateful. But I would say that my entry point into abolition was how I entered movement. And many folks have heard this story before, but one night I was kicking it with my homies, and in our lazy fashion was getting ready to go to a ladies at play party in Atlanta. Oh yes, oh yes. And she spotted a hottie and was like, yo, Mary, go talk to her. Get the read. And no problem, I'm a good wingman. So I went over to this woman and I asked her, you know, just chopping it up. And I said, well, what do you do? Like, what do you do? And she's like, I'm trying to stop the shackling of black women while giving birth in prison. What? Yo, what? What? Blew my whole mind, blew my whole mind. I come from a place, my people are from Racine, Wisconsin. Ain't nobody really talking about that, you know? And they should, given how much Wisconsin is caging up our people. But she said that to me, and it blew my mind that it was happening, and it blew my mind that she was doing something about it. And I was like, what in the world? And that's when she became one of, my homie didn't get her, they didn't hook up, but we all became really great friends. We became really great friends. And she said, I want to introduce you to my political home. And that was Southerners on New Ground. And that was Paris Hatcher. I don't know, many of you may know of her work with Black Feminist Futures, but Paris Hatcher was the woman in the bar that night. And since, and in this was probably 2009, I believe, or so. And then in 2011, I believe it was, Kaila Mumbabaro joined the Song of Staff. My word, and blew our whole minds again. Kai's role at the time was to build the fighting arm and the campaign arm inside of song and really strengthen our work when it comes down to campaigns. It's like, we want to win some stuff, want to dismantle some stuff. And Kai, I remember we would sit in her house in Durham. And you know, Kai, who knows Kai Lumumba? Okay. If you know her, you got to love her, Lord. And she would be writing and drawing and art and music. And I remember like one time, like her heat went out, we just in there cold. I can't even describe to you the scenario in which we were in. And she just would tell us stories and complicate what we knew and understood about this work and how we what we understood about organizing and the broader fight that we were up against. And I don't think she was literally, her role was to like get our little scrappy selves together. A lot of us was new inside of the work of song. And she spent years and we sat at her feet, and many of the things that she taught us at the time, we were like, I can't even, what is happening? I don't even know the language. What are you saying right now? But it was a lot of her that instilled in myself and others inside of song, the language and the analysis around the prison industrial complex, and really, you know, held us to task. Like, if we gonna fight, don't, forget I'm in a church, I cuss. Regulate, self-regulate, get your stuff together. If we're gonna be out here fighting, don't be on no BS. We gotta come with the real, and we can't just go for the things that aren't the crumbs for our people. And this is a longer term work and vision around abolition that we're here for. So I'll stop there, but that's how I got in.
Since this is a period in which we don't have a lot of victories to celebrate, and particularly since, Kamau, you raised that question of becoming involved in the Stop Gang Injunctions campaign and experiencing a victory immediately. I was wondering if the rest of you could, or all of you could perhaps think about some important victories that you've been involved in relation to the abolitionist movement.
I'll start off talking about Stop the Injunctions Coalition, just because I think, yeah, it was successful and we won, but we were acting like we won before we even officially won, because I think it's important to define and frame victories beyond like what the definitions of the state offers up to us. So even before the injunctions got repealed, because that was 5 years after everything had started, even before that, we had tested and seen like they weren't actually being enforced. We were like, we won. Before that, we were building strong political relationships with folks all across Oakland, including Xicana Moratorium Coalition. And because of that, we said we won. Because we had people who had been directly impacted listed on the gang injunctions, their loved ones were on the gang injunctions, and they were galvanized to start engaging in community-centered work and building out community-based solutions to increase public safety that weren't criminalizing and ostracizing their own people. We said that we won. And so way before they were officially deauthorized, way before we, had the victory parties, we knew that in all of these particular ways we had won already. We built the skills of a lot of the members of Critical Resistance, including myself and many people who some are here and some aren't here, and I'm holding them all in my heart. But I think, yeah, we also pushed out police chiefs, 3, I believe. We got rid. And that's not to be on the NIMBY tip. That's to reflect like not to be on the not in my backyard tip, because unfortunately some of those police chiefs ended up in different cities, like Anthony Batts, who was in Baltimore when Freddie Gray was murdered. And so like, I don't wanna be like, we got rid of him and that's dope. He's still in other places ruining many people's lives and terrorizing communities. But it was an ability, it did give us the ability to show the power of the people and to put fear in the hearts of those decision makers who were trying to play folks to the left and act like this wasn't a big deal. And I think in those ways, and also in the shifting of the conversation around what is the purpose and impact of policing, what should public safety look like in Oakland, who does know what the solutions are, and it was the conversation and the messaging and the energy was, we know what our communities need, we know how to keep each other safe, and I think that has been something that has carried on into other anti-policing work and abolition work more broadly in Oakland, whether it's from Stop Urban Shield to closing down the San Francisco City Jail. Like, it's based on the fact that community members know what they need. Community members are the experts in their experiences, and because of those things, I think it's important to highlight the Stop the Injunctions Coalition and highlight like all the different angles of what victory means and what it looks like, and not just the like after 5 years it got deauthorized. Yeah.
Run it.
Okay. All righty, friends. I love this question for a lot of the same reasons that you unpacked. You know, I think for song and for many folks in the South, in a red state, you know, policy victories are oftentimes, you know, far and few between. However, I think that inside of Song's work, we've been able to have a blessing of being able to work inside of coalitions and alliances that have been able for us to advance our vision of what a South free from fear looks like. And some of that has looked like some of our work when we started doing like some really like throwing down and doing direct action was alongside of one of our comrade organizations, the Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights. And this is at the time when the Arizona anti-immigration bills were began spreading across the South, and Georgia had adopted its version of it. And part of that work was being able to dismantle some of the things that they had in there, one of which was deeply important, where they were going to begin arresting folk who were caught with folk who were undocumented, saying that we could not be sanctuary for each other. And that was one of the interventions we were able to make together. I think over the last few years, we're feeling victorious, you know, for the leaders we've been able to develop and bring into the work. Some of the leadership development pipelines, like the fellowship program, the Lord's work, and seeing the results of that, and many have come to the work through the Mama's Day Bailout campaign work, which is highlighting the crisis. Blessings. Which has been highlighting the crisis of what's happening in our communities around the issue of bail and pretrial detention. And so in Atlanta, we've been able to move the needle, if you will, around bail. And last year, I believe some of the numbers were saying that last year, before the bail ordinance kicked in, there were up to 700 or so people in the Atlanta City Jail. Then a year later, it's like 100 and something, and they're like, you know, looking crazy because they're like, oh snap, we're like having to give folk the pink slip. I think in our victory, we also have to grapple with what does it mean for like, those are primarily Black people getting the pink slip. And we also are like begging the question, and we know like, you know, we know this isn't the work. I hope, well, at least we hope, that folks didn't like, we wanted to be, you know, caging our people and being, you know, a part of this system in this way. And so I think that it creates opportunities for us to really think about what is on the other side of that for our people, and to go back to even do some visioning with folk who, you know, have been corrections officers. Like, what has been your dream? What is it that you wanted and desired? And create the openings to do that as we were building something else in terms of alternatives. But I just have to shout out some of the comrades in Harrisonburg, Virginia, a few years ago, who, with a coalition of folks, stopped the stopped the opening of a jail in Harrisonburg, and we've seen, and many folks have been clocking it, just what it has meant, particularly in rural Southern communities where jails and prisons are becoming, you know, the way in which people get their bread and butter. And folks are like, I don't care if you're going to bring jobs. We don't want those kind of jobs. And so I think that, those are some of the things that are on top. But I'll stop there. Thank you. Gotta cut me off.
Well, I'll just give a little bit more context to the Stop the Injunctions Coalition, because All of Us or None, which is a grassroots civil rights organization of people who have been in prison and our families, joined with Critical Resistance to start a campaign before Stop the Injunctions Coalition, which was called Plan for a Safer Oakland. You can probably see some of the posters that we produced during that time. We had lots and lots of rallies and did a lot of advocating for a series of real policy recommendations that Stop the Injunctions Coalition came out of. And one of the policy initiatives that we pushed really hard for is a national campaign that I'm sure some of you have heard of, which is Ban the Box. And that's right. I would say that one of the major victories that Critical Resistance really accomplished, starting with Plan for a Safer Oakland and probably even before, is that we have changed the discourse about public safety and public health. And that is crucially important because it has laid the basis for a whole range of policy initiatives that are really important. For example, the Drug Policy Alliance initiatives to legalize drugs, to expand treatment, to basically stop the incarceration of people who suffer from drug addiction. So I think that the importance of changing that discourse should not be underestimated, because it is the basis for us making a mass argument about stopping incarceration, specifically stopping the mass incarceration of Black and brown people. And it gives us a way forward, which is a positive plan for making our communities safer with community leadership. Not the elected officials, not the people, not the corporations, not the Chamber of Commerce, but us. And Oakland Power Projects is building on that. So I think it's really important, just as a historical moment, to look at the fact that we started with Plan for a Safer Oakland. That built because of the positive nature of what we were fighting for, that led us to recognize what the militarization of our communities was happening with the injunctions, and the fact that Oakland won and stopped the gang injunctions in a precedent-setting way, they aren't using gang injunctions in the same way that they were trying to. And then to recognize that as we developed and countered the state, we were able to stop Urban Shield. We were able to stop the construction of new jails and immigration detention centers. So if we look at the development of our movement through history, and it's a short history, 20 years is not that long, I think that we can see the momentum is building, and it's our job to keep that momentum going. I just wanted to say one more thing. I do also think it's really important that we recognize that Critical Resistance was key in developing Californians United for a Responsible Budget, CURB, which has enabled us as a statewide movement to be very much more powerful and more unified. So I don't think we should underestimate the importance of Critical Resistance's contribution to starting CURB, and the also really important contribution that CURB is making to our ability to impact state policy. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Linda. I think that you've all been describing what we might call abolitionist victories. And, I'd like to move the conversation in the direction of thinking about precisely what abolition means. Because there are those who assume that when we say that we want to abolish the prison industrial complex, that if short of getting rid of the whole system, what might be a victory in an abolitionist struggle? It's sort of similar to the whole debate around reform and revolution. There have been those who argue that that reforms really are not helpful to the revolution, but the conception of the revolution is often bringing the capitalist system down in one fell swoop, and I don't think we're ever going to do that. So how do we know when we're winning abolitionist victories, as opposed to, say, the larger victory of having ever increasing numbers of people focusing on the prison question, which means that there are also right-wing people thinking about what to do about the prison crisis. There's that organization, the Right on Crime, and Newt Gingrich, and all of those folks who think of mass incarceration as the largest, short of the military, the largest governmental project, and so it needs to be downscaled. But I don't think that's what we're talking about. No. We're talking about something very different. So how how does one distinguish between simply the popularization of the problems related to prison and moving along an abolitionist trajectory? So I don't know if
I'll chew on that for a second.
Okay.
I got a few thoughts here. Let me see. Well, one thing that's been stirring in my spirit lately is that I believe that abolition has always been the demand. Has always been a demand for Black people that survived the Middle Passage. Rather, that was the abolition of chattel slavery, Jim Crow, the prison industrial complex. And so I believe in that, and that demand is not just one of the systems that are very much in place, but also it's also calling for a different level of spiritual transformation. And so I think that when we think about abolitionist wins and when we think about those victories, that they also can be recognized by the way in which our relationships to each other have shifted, and the way power relationships have shifted, the way our hearts and minds bring more compassion to the way in which we think about harm and the way we respond when harm has happened. I think that it calls for a clear divestment in cages and courts, cops, and into community-based resources and infrastructure, and an investment in those things, which is a frame that many folk been doing the work have been talking about. We must divest and we must invest. And so I think some of those things are what stands up for me. And I believe, particularly in the South, the Black radical tradition calls us to think about and to be steadfast in the spiritual transformation that we are seeking in this time. And not just, for years, song has begged the question, are we willing to be transformed in the service of the work? And in doing the work of abolishing jails and prisons and cages and this, the PIC, there is something different that we all should feel different, wake up different, more alive, more in love, more, you know what I mean? Yeah, so I'm gonna lay that down, but that's what's for us. That's how we clocking it, and that's how we recognizing it.
I think for myself, I mean, abolition. One of the ways that I measure where abolition is going, and if you've heard me talk, you probably heard this before too, is my mom. Joyce Walton is a Leo that lives in Columbus, Ohio. She is my mom. I love her, and she definitely does not identify as an abolitionist. And 8 years deep, she's still calling critical resistance critical political. But and like through my time in CR, which isn't even half the time that CR has existed, my family's been impacted by policing and imprisonment a lot. And I think that and me just talking to her about the work, I think conversations are shifting from it is what it is to why aren't we actually doing things that actually make people safer, don't put people in the same position. So why are we investing in building a new police station when your little cousin has a school that's falling apart? And so I think there are a lot more questions that are coming up. Yeah. And I think that's an important part of abolition is actually digging into what the root causes are of things. People trying to figure out what are the conditions that need to be shifted to prevent this from happening, not how do we criminalize or isolate or dehumanize or disappear this person because they did this thing, but like, where were you at when that thing was happening? What did you need when that thing was happening? What do we need to ensure that that thing doesn't happen again? Or how can we build up the skills to respond to that thing ourselves? And so I think when it comes to abolitionist victories and abolitionist work, it's not necessarily just everyone being like, yes, F the police. Thank you for the censorship reminder. I tend to be real filthy when I do public speaking, so thank you, Mary. So it's not shouting F the police, which is not what my mom is saying, but I think she and many other folks have started to question what the purpose of policing is. I think abolition also looks like building up what we want and need instead. So things like the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, the storytelling and organizing project, like the Oakland Power Project, shout out. So that is something where we, after the Stop the Injunctions Coalition won, there had been folks on the injunction list in East Oakland that built out these community and cultural spaces, including a community garden in East Oakland, where community members were interviewed about their stories around emergencies that led them to call 911. Cops showed up, didn't actually resolve the thing that needed to be resolved, and also shared what they would want to see instead. Out of that came the Oakland Power Projects, which the goal of it is to eventually abolish the Oakland Police Department by building the capacity of folks in Oakland to respond to harm or moments of crisis without involving the police. So from that, there has been a lot of political and personal building with healers and health workers across the city to build out these workshops that have trained, I don't even know how many people, hundreds of folks, around how to respond to emergency situations, whether it's a mental health crisis or an opioid overdose. And so part of abolition is actually shifting so that we can look to ourselves to keep each other safe. Like, what does that mean? It means concrete skill building. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody needs to know how to respond to every part. Somebody can de-escalate, the other person can make a sandwich because we all need to eat. But you know, it's building up the skills so that we're not like, we don't know what else to do except call 911. It's giving ourselves more of those options and building that up within ourselves and not necessarily depending on the state, which is trying to maintain the status quo in a lot of ways to do that for us.
Yeah.
I guess I'll just add that we have a lot of abolitionist victories to still fight for.
Yeah.
And one of the things that the California Coalition for Women Prisoners and other organizations around the state is fighting to do is to drop life without parole sentencing. Now, it's a very crucial moment that we're in, because in the last election, the felony murder rule was defeated in California. That is a major victory that came about through the electoral process. Now our job is to move that forward, because what it means is that at least 5,000 people in the California prison system can be resentenced. It's a tremendous number of people that will be able to be resentenced with the end of the felony murder rule. And a lot of those people were sentenced to life without parole. So this is an opportunity for us to have a major impact on decreasing the number of our people who are in prison. So those are the kinds of opportunities that I think we as activists and our organizations need to unite to take advantage of and to push forward.
Can I also just add real quick that like when talking about like what abolitionist work looks like, I feel like a lot of people are like have an aversion to legislative work, have an aversion to like the bureaucratic parts of the work, which is real. I have a slight aversion myself, but like there are reforms that are reformist, that are things that we're going to have to work ourselves out of later, and that's not the kind of reform that abolitionists are talking about. We're talking about reforms that actually put us in better fighting form so that we can get more of our people free, that put us in a position where communities have more decision-making power. And so if it's something that you might have to work yourself out of later, like that's not necessarily abolitionist. If it's something that's decriminalizing one group of people while increasing sentencing for another group of people, that's not abolitionist. That's not what we're talking about. It's how are we cutting back the life and scope of the prison industrial complex and its reach into our communities. And that can be done legislatively. It's really hard. I haven't seen it done as much, but again, my slight aversion leads to that ignorance. But I think when thinking about abolitionist work, it's not exclusively like in this particular container that's in the streets and on the ground, and that might be the place where some of us are comfortable, but it's important to remember in thinking about building relationships with other groups of folks who have shared politics but do the work in different spaces, because there are possibilities to do more abolitionist work, but you have to be willing to push. You have to be able to identify the co-optation, which hopefully we'll talk about a little bit more, because that is a big piece of the thing. But I just want to name that because I feel like sometimes when we talk about abolition, folks don't want to include legislative work, and it's a real part of it.
Yeah. Thank you for naming that.
And I think that the shift from the kinds of questions that we used to ask, the specific questions about, well, how do you change them? How do you make the prison more relevant? Or, you know, how do you create rehabilitation programs? Questions that leave the whole intact while focusing only on what appears to be the specific problem. The shift then to questions like, how do we imagine a society that no longer needs prisons, as opposed to focusing sort of myopically on the problems of the prison? So it seems to me that it's rather than a kind of assimilationalist view in which we want to keep everything else intact, keep the system intact, but change one particular, what appears to be the problem, change the prisons. critical resistance, I think I remember Rachel always making the point that we cannot confine ourselves to the footprint of the prison. In imagining ways to move in an abolitionist direction, we have to ask ourselves what social conditions would be necessary in order to guarantee that we no longer need to use these institutions of violence, these institutions of repression. I wanted to ask a question. I know we're rapidly running out of time. I wanted to ask a question about the relationship between emotional transformation and abolitionist visions. What does an abolitionist trajectory require us to do in terms of being self-critical of the ways in which we think, the ways in which we feel, the ways in which we oftentimes incorporate the impulse of the state in our very emotional reactions? Because the fact that we almost always want to hurt someone who has hurt us reflects the way the system of punishment works. And so how can we make the connections between these two realms? You know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah. Right. Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, there are many days I want to smack, hey, I'm kidding, kind of. But yeah, I think that's I feel like that is where we have an opportunity I feel like I'm keeping like this, to broaden the conversation when we talk about, in a moment in time when our movements talk a lot about self-care. When we talk a lot about self-care, I'm gonna just do this. I think we have an opportunity to broaden that, and many of us have, to engage this conversation around self-work, and what does it look like for us to do the work of mending those things that are triggering us, that are bringing about massive anxiety, and all of those things, I think, are some of the ways in which we can begin sort of sussing that out. And some of it, I think, is just rerouting ourselves in the values that, and looking back over our lives, or maybe hearing testimonies of other people. I have not, if somebody were to have judged me based on my worst days and the times when I have not shown up as my best and have extended me grace and mercy, I wouldn't be sitting right here talking to y'all. And so I think that, and part of our organizing practice is the environment in which we practice those things, right? So it may not be in the concrete moment of intercommunal violence, but I think it does lend us an opportunity to say, hey, in our organizing, when we have harmed somebody, how do we respond? You showing up like the state, saying calm down, you know what I mean? And really thinking about different approaches in the way in which we're dealing with some of the things that happens when humans, break the isolation. And I think that is what we are up against in a lot of ways. The deep isolation that has been brought on by capitalism. Our folks we have to begin defrosting and to actually now what does it mean to be in right relationship with each other in a different way? And that is going to come through practice and come through breaking isolation. And I think it's going to come through us being able to humble ourselves and extend grace and mercy. And yeah, that's the path that I think we're all on and trying to figure out, though,
I have many thoughts and many feelings. I think it's important that we create spaces where people are able to dream wildly I feel like that is one of the biggest things that I've taken from my time in CR is if I have some vision of a different way to respond to the harm and the violence, because I've actually had the opportunity to hear about no cop zones and harm-free zones and the Storytelling and Organizing Project and the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective and all of these different crews that have been working quietly, consistently, experimenting, failing, sharing these different things, then I think there's, number one, that's a way to catch a lot of other folks' attention because they're like, what are you talking about? You ain't gonna call the cops when so-and-so was turning up and acting a fool? But I think it's also helping other people to push and ask more questions and ask why things couldn't look like this instead of what's been offered to us. I think in this political moment, it's important for our people to be able to be as loud, as bold, as wild as these folks are who are plotting against us inside and outside of the White House.
Yeah.
I feel like when I first joined CR, there were many more folks when I was learning and talking about it who were like, oh, I don't know, it sounds a little intense. What do you mean, get rid of the police? And then, you know, like a few years after that, I see folks from BYP 100 on CNN talking about, we want to abolish the police. And I think that is, and in that moment, I was like, I'm gonna flip this table. But I think it's important that there are folks making bold statements and encouraging other people to dream wildly. I think what Mary was saying around how we respond to conflict and harm within our communities and the organizations and groups that we do this work with is really important. I think that has been a struggle, and centering healing in ways that go beyond like minuscule gestures, because the prison industrial complex I mean, I'm sure folks have ideas and concrete ways that they understand that it has impacted their lives individually, and then amplify that to a collective level. And I think there is a real need for healing, and it might not necessarily be in the political space that you're in, but seeking that out from folks who have political alignment feels like a really important part of sustaining this work. Yeah, because it's, you know, we're throwing down real hard. I see a lot of people throwing down real hard all the time, and I think it's important that we balance those things out and do that physically and also with our visions and imaginations.
I have felt the emotional connection with abolition really ever since I was in prison and got out and started working to end the prison industrial complex. But the feelings that really have overwhelmed me since coming out in 2001 was of joy and intense engagement and what it means to build political power. Because all of us or none emerged from formerly incarcerated people. And I remember sitting with Dorsey, Donna, George Galvis, and Marlene Sanchez in the initial planning stages of our first organizing conference for All of Us or None. And Marlene and George really taught me a lesson about healing and the need for healing and how important it is that we incorporate that into our practices, into our organization. And recognizing that and being able to learn from younger people and recognize the need to incorporate healing and restorative justice in all of our practices. I think also we should recognize that that has now been more massified. Where I live in Santa Rosa, the school system now has a restorative justice program. And I don't think that's unusual. I know in Oakland there's one also. So as many critiques as we may have of the ways that those are implemented in the public school system, it does mark the importance of healing and spiritual consciousness, and that is being recognized as a way to abolish punishment in our school systems and in other places. So that is an abolitionist victory, actually. I think another important aspect of the emotional effects of abolition, or our attachment to it, is that the people who are most impacted, black and brown people, people who have been imprisoned ourselves, are actually politically leading what our movement is trying to do. And I think that that's a really important principle. It carries over into all the immigration work, it carries into all of our work, because actually what we have discovered as part of many coalitions that include All of Us or None is that no one is as close to the problems of mass incarceration and what it does to people and our families as we are, the people who have been in prison ourselves. And we are the ones who actually bring a crucial element of specific knowledge. So I know in the Ban the Box efforts all over the country, formerly incarcerated people were the ones who actually came up with specific solutions, who understood the difference of counting time of when a felony is going to be disappeared from your record. It matters if it's counted from the time of conviction or the time of release, right? So a lot of our advocates may not have understood that before our participation in those movements. So I think that that is an important element emotionally also, is empowerment, is feeling that ability to make change. And that's what the movement, the emerging movement of formerly incarcerated people has done. We have attacked the structural discrimination on which the prison industrial complex and its effects are based by going after that symbol of the box in education, in employment, in housing, in many places where people must be able to enter, because we don't believe most of us have ever entered to begin with, to re-enter our communities. There is one other thing I just wanted to say, because we may not have time, I don't know. Angela talked about not responding to those who do harm to us in the same ways that we have been harmed. And that is something to aspire to, definitely. But I feel, as a white person and addressing this audience, that we really have to recognize a couple of major dangers. One is the expansion and the growth and the normalization of white supremacy in our society right now. And it's crucial that, and I keep using that word because I feel like we are here together and we have the opportunity to steel ourselves more in the struggle against white supremacy and against racism and all of it, the ways that it manifests. And if we don't do that, we will not build an abolitionist movement. We will not build the kind of society that we all envision. So I feel we must rededicate ourselves to that fight. And the other aspect that has really been emotionally upsetting to me and tests my ability to respond appropriately is the reassertion of the patriarchy and the attacks against women, the normalization of attacks against women, sexual violence, and the attempt to render trans people non-existent, which of course is an absurdity. So for us to really recognize that the progress that we have made on all of these different, in all of these different arenas is vulnerable. We have a strong movement, and we can, we're building it stronger every day. I truly believe that. I see it up in Santa Rosa and everywhere. But we must be vigilant, and we can't let our guard down, because the forces of evil are really arrayed against us. And we have to hold on to those positive emotions that we're building together, that joy, that power, that feeling of being able to make change, which we recognize. If we look at our history, we've made change. But we have to keep that in our hearts so that we can move forward and rededicate ourselves to the struggles that are so eminently important.
Well, I'm reluctantly, I have to point out that our time is up. I could listen to the three of you for the next several hours. Thank you so much for your insight, for your experiences. Let me just say that we have just begun this conversation. These were questions that were collectively developed by CR people. I had a whole list of questions myself that I didn't get to ask you, but you have, I think, given us so much to reflect on and hope for the future. So thank you very much, Mary, Kamau, Linda.
Thank you, darling.